got the poster, I got you, and I got the screen.
Perfect. Folks, I just want to let you know that you're right here at St. Edward's Parish Hall in Duncan, and that the live stream is live now, and our presenter, Archbishop Bowen, will be up momentarily, and Gwen Jahelka, our Vice Chancellor, will welcome everybody, and we're just testing this equipment, and hopefully out there in TV land, everything will work. We're ready.
Good morning again. Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? No? Yes, you can? Good morning. Is that better?
Yeah.
The side, try side, so you don't have to lean.
Okay, you talk, I'll just adjust.
Good morning. Is that loud enough? At the back, good morning, you can hear me. And more important, Archbishop Don. Turn it up?
Turn it up.
I can speak a bit louder too. I'll just speak louder when I.
Father Roger will turn it up.
He was just here. Where'd Father Roger go? Oh, that's better. Oh, there you are. Is that loud enough, Father Roger?
You're yelling.
I'm yelling? Am I yelling? I'll talk normally. Is everyone can hear all right, okay. We'll get going. Again, welcome to our day, our Diocesan Faith Day, seeking truth, healing, and reconciliation. We are delighted today to welcome Most Reverend Don Boland, Archbishop of Regina. Yay, exactly! Who comes to us first and foremost as a friend to journey along with us. Good friend of Bishop Gary, good friend of Father William Hahn, good friend of many of you here, I understand, lots of beautiful connections. And when I say friend, I mean a friend who will truly help us journey on this walk toward healing and enlighten us, accompany us in ways where we in turn can reach out to others and to meet our neighbor where they are at. I am not going to give a lengthy, because if you read his very impressive CV that was a part of the registration, it amazes me the incredible work Archbishop Don has done in many different areas, ecumenical connections, serving in roles, and definitely one of the biggest roles he has served in that really impacts us today is that, of course, he was a part of the delegation to go to Rome to meet with Pope Francis, and then in turn a part of the group who welcomed Pope Francis in Canada. So I know you're going to really enjoy the day. He spoke to all employees yesterday, employees, clergy, religious. As Bishop says, anyone who gets a paycheck heard him yesterday. And so we're delighted that he is with us today. And so without further ado, Archbishop Don Boland.
Thanks very much, Gwen. Okay, so now, because this is going to be a while, is this, can you all hear me properly? Yeah. A couple people struggling, but, so I'm very grateful to be with you. Grateful to the Diocese of Victoria and to Bishop Gary for all the good things you do. In many ways, the Archdiocese in Regina, Diocese of Saskatoon, the Diocese of Victoria have similar commitments and fields of engagement. Ecumenical, in terms of walking with Indigenous people, and in terms of engaging survivors and victims of clergy sexual abuse, and in many other ways. So good to be with you, and as Gwen mentioned, good to be with many people that I know here, including former colleagues like Mona and members of a faith community that I'm a part of, Madonna House, and former allies in ecumenical work such as Terry, and first cousins such as Vic, and so good to be among many people that I know. So I just want to say at the outset that the topic is not exactly as announced. Gwen needed to put something on a poster, and I was working at 12 other things, so we had a general consensus that I would be talking about the papal visit, that I would be talking about Paschal mystery, and we had lots of details to still work out. Thanks, Mom. So this is the plan. The first talk is taking a quote from Pope Francis's address at Saint Anne de Beaupré in Quebec, from failure to hope, really describing what he saw as where we are at as church in Canada and where we needed to move. And so he provides us something of a roadmap, and I want to unpack that, which is a recovery of our Paschal bearings, our bearings as people grounded in the death and resurrection of Christ. Secondly, I'm going to speak about the papal apology, which was expressed at various times during his visit, and I want to unpack that apology because I think it's really important for us as church to be able to interpret and understand that apology. I'm going to identify 6 elements or themes that really come out in the context of the Pope's offering of an apology and in his addresses here. And then we'll ask you, and there'll be a table conversation in each session, ask you how you can be instruments of extensions of that apology in relations with First Nations and Métis and Inuit peoples. And the third address, the last one, will be about really seeds of an action plan for the Church in Canada that the Pope really has embedded in the addresses he gave us. And really an invitation also to you to identify where you see yourself as potentially being involved or already very involved for a long period of time, some of you, in finding a new way to walk together with Indigenous people that is truly life-giving for all concerned. So that's the plan. And this first presentation is one that I have only given once, which was yesterday, and has got lots of things to still be worked out. So it's a little rough around the edges. When you get to the second presentation, I'm already now in home territory. So I want to begin by saying that I think not so much as for Indigenous communities, but for the Church, these are hard times. These have been very difficult years where we have been called to task in a very demanding way, and where news, media reports have presented parts of a narrative which is, where there are elements of truth but which are incomplete, where it's been pretty much impossible for a long period of time to say anything positive about anyone who was connected with a residential school. And I think the Pope's address has helped to shift that. The Catholic Church is taking ownership of responsibilities is really what opened the door for that larger narrative to be told. But it's been very difficult. In the summer of 2021, after ground-penetrating radar findings in Kamloops, and then several weeks later, ground-penetrating radar findings in Cowessess First Nation near Regina. That critique of the church, and not only a provincial or national focus, but an international focus on the church's failings, really was brought front and center. In Saskatchewan, CBC, if my count is accurate, 90 out of 92 days had an article really calling the church to task, and especially our failure to, in the Moving Forward Together campaign of several years ago, to raise money that was called for in the Indian residential school settlement, at the same time as building a new cathedral in Saskatoon and raising money to renovate a cathedral in Regina. That was just put right in front of the world to see. So it has been a difficult time. As I say, it's not as difficult for the church as it has been for survivors of residential schools and for Indigenous communities who carry a deep, deep trauma and many challenges. But our challenge is also real, and they're connected. So how do we find hope in the midst of that? How do we find good bearings to go forward in a healthy way? A friend of mine wrote me an email a little while ago, and I think his sentiments express the sentiments of many in the church. He was quoting from Tolkien, a line from Tolkien where, those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, Galadriel is speaking to Frodo and says how she and her husband, together through the ages of the world, have fought the long defeat. And this friend was saying, it feels like that's what it's like to be in the church today. We had a sense of energy, especially after the council. There was a sense of energy that we were going to unleash a new, positive, constructive, healthy, engaged model of church that was in dialogue with society and that was really bringing good news in good ways. And it feels in many ways that we have just struggled over and over and over again. And so that metaphor of fighting the long defeat. Tolkien, in fact, does not think that's a despairing thing. And I'm going to put up a quotation in a little while where Tolkien talks about the cross and really challenges a notion of history that things are actually getting better and better and better, and that eventually we're going to have the kingdom of God because things got so good, And he said that is not the Christian narrative. And yet it is a narrative that our society largely has accepted, and that we in the church breathe in and often breathe out too, that we need to make things better and better and better, and of course we try, and we're responsible for trying to do. But that's not the gospel narrative, and the gospel narrative is what is intended and able to give us a deep foundational hope going forward. So I want to turn to some quotations from Pope Francis, some of what he said in Quebec City or at St. Anne de Beaupré. And the homily that day, before you read it all here, because we're going to read it together, but you can read it if you like. Right? The homily that day was the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And the disciples on the road to Emmaus have some glimpse that the tomb was empty, but no understanding. And they are leaving, and they are depressed. And it's in that context that the risen Lord comes to us. And Pope Francis is telling us that's a narrative for us, here and now. So let's read it. The journey of the disciples to Emmaus.
At the conclusion of Luke's Gospel is an icon of our own personal journey and that of the Church. On the path of life and faith,
As we seek to achieve the dreams, plans, hopes, and expectations deep in our hearts, We also come up against our own frailties and weaknesses. We experience setbacks and disappointments, and often we can remain imprisoned by a paralyzing sense of failure. Yet, and we'll go to the next one here. Continues, yet the gospel tells us that at those moments we are not alone, for the Lord comes to meet us and stands at our side. He accompanies us on our way with the discretion of a gentle fellow traveler who wants to open our eyes and make our hearts once more burn within us. Whenever our failures lead to an encounter with the Lord, life and hope are reborn, and we are able to be reconciled with ourselves, with our brothers and sisters, and with God. So let us follow the itinerary of this journey. We can call it a journey from failure to hope. Thank you. So, what the Pope wants to do is plant us and remind us of the experience of the disciples, and that our journey can find hope by looking closely at the experience of the disciples of Jesus at the time of his passion and death, and then at the time of the resurrection. Standing alongside the disciples is accompanying them and witnessing a darkness that was so dark because it was the complete devastation of their hopes. It was the complete destruction of the vision that they had of what God was doing in Jesus. It was an act of extreme cruelty, an act of injustice, of violence, and in a sense an act which silenced the truth that they had come to believe in, that God was with us, that God was outpouring a boundless love upon us, that God was opening a horizon of hope within which we could live, believing that God was walking with us each and every day. So the disciples' shattered hope is what the Emmaus disciples, Clopas and companion, bring into that gospel. And they were going home. I mean, they were leaving the community of disciples. They were walking away from it all, confused, bewildered, and probably going back to life as they knew it before encountering Jesus. It is really of immense importance for us in the Christian community to remember that the hope born with the resurrection is born into that place of deepest darkness, that place of no hope, that place of profound despair. Because, well, in the creed, he died and rose from the dead. Now we have, he died, descended into hell, and rose from the dead, but we can say it all in about 5 seconds. And we lose, if we're not attentive, what is being spoken there about how God comes into our world. It is really at the heart of death, at the heart of darkness, that hope springs forth with the resurrection. A couple of stories, and I think as Christian community, we're just constantly needing to come back to this and find ways to enter in. So my apologies to Mona, because she's heard all these stories before. Right? But these are kind of the stories for me that have helped me enter into the Paschal mystery in a deep, deep way. I remember, I haven't heard this one, my first Easter, and I was preparing my first Easter homily, and kind of struggling, and I called my friend Jennifer Cooper, who had been a master student with me, and I said, so how are you? How would you preach resurrection? And she basically said to me what I just said to you, right? Make sure people understand that the resurrection isn't a natural outflowing of everything Jesus said and did, but it's a radical rupture with the reality of death, that something new bursts forth in a way that changes everything, but it bursts forth out of that place of deepest darkness. And I found a story by Paul Tillich, the Lutheran theologian, and it's written in the 60s, but he's writing about the Nuremberg war trial and the experiences, the stories that were told in the Nuremberg war trial. And he tells the story of a man who, having escaped from the gas chambers, a Jewish man, finds refuge in a Jewish graveyard. And many other Jews had fled to that place. And there's a little slide here from Tillich's account. In a grave nearby, a young woman gave birth to a boy in a grave. The 80-year-old gravedigger, wrapped in a linen shroud, assisted. When the newborn child uttered his first cry, the old man prayed, "Great God, hast thou finally sent the Messiah to us? For who else than the Messiah himself can be born in a grave?" Tillich ponders that logic of the gravedigger, that his sense that new life rising from the tomb is the definitive sign of God's presence that we need, that other ways of God speaking to us don't penetrate to the heart of the deepest struggles of human life, that only the Messiah can bring birth out of death. The other story I'd share is a story that comes from years when I was working at the Vatican at the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. And one of my responsibilities was to lead the Vatican's team in dialogue with World Council of Churches Faith and Order team in preparing the text for the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. And this was 2005, and every year, either the Faith and Order Commission or the Holy See worked with a particular country to prepare first drafts of materials. And this particular year, the materials were being prepared in South Africa. And the little group that was organized there was from the township of the informal settlement in Umlazi, which was near the city of Durban. And this was after apartheid had come to an end, but apartheid ended. All the civil unrest and economic inequality was still deeply embedded. And then the HIV/AIDS pandemic hit the country with tremendous force, without adequate medical resources. And the Anglican priests that came on behalf of that group to meet with us as we prepared the text relayed that 50% of the population of Umlazi was HIV positive. So it was a place that was absolutely devastated by this pandemic. So, and he relayed that in Umlazi there was one big post office and one big hospital and one of everything, but many different churches and one cemetery. And that division that didn't help the Christian communities. But one thing that Christian communities decided to do, because every funerals, because there were so many people dying in every Christian community, funerals were held on Saturdays, and they were almost always mass funerals. And then they'd go to the cemetery. But on Holy Saturday, they made the joint agreement that they would all go to the cemetery before they started their Easter services, before they started their Easter vigils. And there, in the place where they had just buried so many of their dead and where their grief was localized in a profound way, they all would light their Paschal candles, and together they would profess, "Christ is risen from the dead." And then they would return to their separate churches for their separate Easter celebrations. It is a profound gesture because it is the resurrection that does open a door for us to move forward. So Pope Francis, back to the Emmaus text, says, and I don't think I have this on a PowerPoint, let's just take a peek here. No, don't read that one yet. So got to give you this in sequence. He says that there is a sense of failure haunting the hearts of the two disciples after the death of Jesus. They had enthusiastically pursued a dream, pinned all their hopes and desires on him. After his scandalous death on the cross, they were leaving Jerusalem, going back to their former lives. They were on a return trip. The Messiah had been executed on the cross like a common criminal. Their cherished expectations had come to naught. The hopes they had put in Jesus had been dashed. The dreams they had dreamed had ended in disappointment and sorrow. And now he says that experience also marks our own lives and our spiritual journey. At those times when we are forced to recalibrate expectations and to cope with our failings and the ambiguities and confusions of life. When our high ideals come up against life's disappointments, and we abandon our goals due to our weakness and inadequacies, when we embark on great projects but then find we cannot carry them out, when sooner or later all of us in our daily lives and relationships experience a setback, a mistake, a failure, or fall, and see what we had believed in or committed ourselves to coming to naught, then we feel crushed by our sins and by feelings of remorse. And I think there's one more. I liked it when you were all reading together, but I think for the folks online, or for live stream, that's probably better that well, let's read this one together and I'll read it as well so the folks online can hear it too. At those times, we can do a little more than cling to our sense of failure and ask, what happened? Why did it happen? How could it happen? Brothers and sisters, these are our own questions, and they are the burning questions that this pilgrim church in Canada is asking with heartfelt sorrow on its difficult and demanding journey of healing and reconciliation. In confronting the scandal of evil and the body of Christ wounded in the flesh of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we too have experienced deep dismay. We too feel the burden of failure. And then I think there's one more beautiful gesture from the Pope, which really symbolizes what his whole visit was about. Allow me to accompany you as a church in pondering these questions that arise from hearts filled with pain. Why did all this happen? How could this happen in the community of those who follow Jesus? I think that's the question, the burning question that the Pope came to help us address and that we need to address collectively today. So he gives us a few indicators of how we move forward. And the first thing he said is, don't run away. Don't run away from this experience. He says we need to attend to the temptation to flee, but not give in to it. Those disciples that on the way to Emmaus were fleeing so that they wouldn't have to think about it anymore. When we're confronted with failures in life, we aren't comfortable. And we like to suppress those difficult feelings. But we've got to work our way through them with honesty and trust and a commitment to go forward. And then Pope Francis basically says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, turn to Jesus, turn to what happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus as a lens to give you hope. I always think about, resonate with, I identify with Peter at the time of the death of Jesus, who, under the intense pressure of the circumstances of Jesus' arrest, he's followed, he's been a lead disciple, Jesus calls him to walk on the water, calls him a rock, but he falls into the water and calls him a rock, but he really immediately says, don't don't go and get crucified. And so Peter's always in this learning relationship and this stumbling relationship, but his biggest stumble is at the time of the cross, where he just denies knowing Jesus at all. And Jesus, the risen Lord, the gospel doesn't say Jesus comes to Peter and says, "Peter, I forgive you," but the risen Lord comes to him and says, "Peter, do you love me?" 3 times. Do you love me? Then feed my flock, then tend my sheep, tend my lambs. Jesus sends him forth in a mission where he has clearly been forgiven. From a Christian framework, the Word becoming incarnate, God entering into our history, telling us about the depths of God's mercy for us, and the human response being to crucify the incarnate Word is pretty much as bad as we can manage it as a human race. And that is forgiven. That is forgiven in the resurrection. There is nothing, St. Paul says, nothing that can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. And he names all kinds of things that might separate us. And here we have to name our own deep, deep failures as Christian disciples and as communities. Do not need to separate us. That doesn't take us off the hook, and it doesn't make us passive in the need to address injustice. But it does mean that we can trust that God is merciful, that God is, Pope Francis says, the name of God is mercy. My little motto as a bishop, because I have absolutely, through the entirety of my life, mess things up so often. I have people who can testify to that my motto is from Thomas Merton: mercy within mercy within mercy. And people say, where do you come up with that? I say, well, I need that, But that's what is revealed in the Paschal mystery. A message that God is boundless mercy. So it's there that we can find the courage and the conviction to go forward in hope, even amidst our serious failures. Now, that's not the total story. It's not the end of the story. We're going to talk about apology. We're going to talk about action plan. But from a Christian faith perspective, there are a lot of people right now that just feel pretty despairing about the church, that are feeling a deep struggle about belonging or continuing in their membership in the church. There are people who just feel the weight of shame and aren't finding a way forward. And the gospel at its heart tells us that God gives us a way forward, that God does not allow our sin and our mistakes to be the end of the story. The other quote that I want to leave you with from St. Paul is from 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, God in Christ is reconciling the world to himself and sending us forth as ambassadors of reconciliation. One of the things I was asked to do, Gwen said, we need to have our understanding of reconciliation expanded a little. We need to go to the foundations of this work of truth and reconciliation. Yesterday in his homily, Bishop Gary said, it's like some people are saying, well, are we ready to move on from this topic of reconciliation to another topic? And he said, well, it's the only topic, right? It's what God is doing. God, in entering into the world and communicating and showing us his face in Jesus, is reconciling the world to himself and sending us forth as instruments of reconciliation, as instruments of healing. So it's not a storyline we can kind of deal with on Monday and move away from on Tuesday. So with that little homily of I want to give you some time in groups around your tables to discuss a couple things here. So how's our time? Well, let's take 5 or 6 minutes. How have you been impacted by failings within the church community? How do you carry them? And how does our Paschal faith open a door to moving forward, empowered in a good way? I realize you could take an hour on those questions or longer, but if you just take 5 or 6 minutes to each share just a little bit on that, and then we'll talk about a Paschal way of thinking and acting. Thanks.
Anyway, I've changed a lot of recommendations. We still donate the same why am I supporting this? It's not that I hate it, but
And that is beautiful. When I was putting this first started, the oldest fighting shape one of the sister. And it was like the little gift from God.
Maybe, sounds like you're having great discussions. Let's say 2 more minutes. Okay, I'm feeling bad about this. I asked a really good question, I guess.
That's 2 really good questions.
2. Usually when you break people into groups, after 5 or 7 minutes, at least 3 or 4 groups are completely at a standstill and you feel that it's only the eager ones who are keeping going, but I think I'm interrupting important conversations at every one of your tables. I can only do so promising that you're going to have a couple more cracks at this. So I just want to keep fairly close. If we go a couple minutes over and move behind the schedule a little, I think that's okay, but I don't want to get too far behind. So thank you for engaging so deeply in that conversation. It sounds like those are the questions that people are asking and needing to grapple with today. when Pope Francis talks about the disciples on the road to Emmaus, he talks about what Jesus does. I mean, he first of all comes and walks with them in their despair and promises to do that for us. And then what he does is he unpacks history, a way of telling the story which helps them to see things in a new way and helps them to see where God has been active all along, but to see it in a new way. And that's what Pope Francis says we need to do here. The resurrection is intended to change our entire horizon of thinking and of engagement in the world. Martin Luther King says, Easter is an eternal reminder that this truth-crushed earth will rise again. And then he quotes Thomas Carlyle, no lie can live forever. How do we live our faith in the resurrection in the context of a world that is still wounded, still broken, still deeply damaged? And in this instance, how do we live our faith in a resurrection when our faith community has been a part of the wounding and the damaging? I think the residential school system puts that right in our face, but it's ours, the story of the Christian community, right? Through history. There isn't a Christian community, a group of Christians out there. There are saints, but there's no one who hasn't been living their lives in some way, in ways that contradict the message we proclaim and in a way that wound others. So it's not a new question. We just feel it very acutely today. So how do we live that Paschal hope? And at least what's the goal? What's the ideal before us to motivate us? And I want to talk about that very briefly in two ways. What I would call Paschal logic or Paschal thinking, and Paschal living, Paschal action. Being rooted in the death and resurrection of Christ means seeing the world in a particular way. It means thinking and processing our experiences through a particular lens, even when that lens is shaped by doubt and by evidence to the contrary out of our personal experience. It means seeking to interpret our experience and our deepest struggles through that lens. I found a poem a while ago from Kenneth Boulding, and maybe we can go that I like very much. This was written in the 1940s in the aftermath of the Second World War. Although hate rises in enfolding flame, at each renewed oppression soon it dies. It sinks away. It sinks as quickly as we saw it rise. While love's small constant light burns still the same. Know this, though love is weak and hate is strong, yet hate is short and love is very long. It's Paschal thinking, right? It's thinking with a different lens. Now I want to go to that Tolkien quote. This is actually a quote from an Orthodox writer, Stephen Freeman, talking about Tolkien's phrase of living the long defeat, right? So he says, Tolkien notes that within the long defeat there are glimpses of the final victory. And Freeman writes, I would go further and say that the final victory already tabernacles among us. That's a beautiful phrase. It hovers within and over our world, shaping it and forming it, even within its defeat. For the nature of our salvation is a defeat, the cross. Therefore, the defeat within the world itself is not a tragic deviation from the end, but an end that was always foreseen and present within the cross itself. And the cross itself was present from before the foundation of the world. Now that's something that you can do some deep pondering on. It's a beautiful Orthodox way of seeing the world and all of our experience and all of human history. All of human history, including the history before the incarnation, through a Paschal lens. Abraham Heschel, the wonderful Jewish writer and rabbi, relays Jewish midrash. When God gets up in the morning, God gathers the angels of heaven around and says, where does my world need healing today? I think that's a a way of phrasing our mission as church, as disciples, to move from a way of Paschal thinking to a sphere of Paschal engagement with the world. Jesus told his disciples, those who want to save their lives will lose it, and those who lose themselves will, for my sake, will save it. He says that according to the Gospels. There's 6 different places where the Gospels relate that. So it's not like your typical 3, because each of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, will all say it, but clearly this was a major theme in Jesus' teaching. That's a saying that only makes sense if you understand that when you spend yourself, you're never fully spent, but that God, in God's grace, continues to replenish you, and that by giving of yourself, you enter more deeply into human life, into human relationship, into human community. I want to turn to one more quote here from the wonderful Annie Dillard. And this is I think of it best as a poem, but if I put it as a poem, it was going to take three slides. Annie Dillard is an American writer. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974 for the amazing book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, another beautiful book from 77, Holy the Firm, just a remarkable spiritual writer. And she wrote a book called The Writing Life, where she's talking about writing, but really she's also talking about spiritual life. She's talking about grace. And so the quote is this: "One of the few things I know about writing is this: spend it all, shoot it, play it, lose it all, right away, every time. Do not hoard what seems good for a later place in the book or for another book. Give it all, give it now. The impulse to save something good for a better place later is the signal to spend it now. Something more will arise for later, something better. These things fill from behind, from beneath, like well water." That is the best description I know of God's grace, right? God's grace is never fully spent. God continues to pour life into us so that we can pour ourselves out. That's what Paschal living is. These things fill from behind, from beneath, like well water. Similarly, the impulse to keep to yourself what you have learned is not only shameful, it's destructive. Anything you do not freely and abundantly give freely and abundantly becomes lost to you. You open your safe and find ashes. Paschal thinking should lead to Paschal living, to Paschal engagement with the world. The risen Lord wants to empower us to spend ourselves fully and generously at the service of others. I want to leave you with 2 things. First, a little quote from St. Paul, which is very pertinent here, from 2 Corinthians 4, where he talks about the disciples as earthen vessels. We carry a treasure, but we carry that treasure in the broken lives that we live. And he goes on to talk about the intimate connection between the struggles of the Christian community and the crucified and risen body of Christ. And he writes, "We are afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted, maybe persecuting, but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies." That's what Paschal living looks like. The other thing I want to leave you with, and this will be just right because I'll end right at 11:30, is from my ecumenical days. When I worked at the Vatican, the major responsibility was working with Anglicans and Methodists. And I had done doctoral work on Anglicans, but I didn't know anything about Methodists, and it was such a beautiful discovery to really encounter the richness of Methodist tradition, which is really a spiritual movement within Anglicanism, is where it grows. And the Methodists have something called the Covenant Service, and they celebrate that Covenant Service every January 1st in all their communities. And they have variations of the covenant, but the covenant is a way of renewing your commitment as an individual and as a community, your commitment to discipleship. It's a text that I think reminds me very much of St. Ignatius' Sucipe, take, Lord, receive all my liberty, my memory, understanding, my entire will. The Methodist covenant service includes this individual and collective statement before God. Put me to what you will, put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. That's a kind of a freedom that we can only enter into if we have a deep and abiding trust that we are cared for in a boundless way. So Paschal living is living in freedom. It's living in full generosity, in confidence that God will always hold us tenderly and commissions us to live that way in the world. So that's it for round one. Second talk after lunch, we're moving into the meat of Pope Francis's apology and then an action plan going forward. Have a great lunch.
Hard act to follow. We have a pretty significant representation from throughout the diocese here in this room right now. Every part of the diocese is here, and we've also got live streaming. I think it's important to, even for me, to let you know initiatives of resurrection, and they're not my initiatives. And it's important to, as we maybe perhaps need to find the graveyard, which we've all discovered very in our face, Kamloops and Cowassis, and other places. But it's important to know some initiatives where you would not expect to experience resurrection, where you may only be experiencing death and pain and suffering and failure. So within 3 weeks of the Kamloops event, which for Bishop Don and I changed everything, more or less, not that we didn't see it coming, I guess, after our many years of work in Indigenous communities and with victims of sexual abuse. But this is where we have to be a little bit aware of where resurrection comes. And so within 3 weeks of that event, the community of Ahousaht and the Ahousaht people, there's about 300 or 400 Ahousaht people, Nuu-chah-nulth speaking people that live in Victoria. It was on their mind, the mind of the hereditary chiefs and the elected chief, to hold a dinner at Our Lady of the Rosary Hall. Some Our Lady of the Rosary people are here. You may have been at that dinner. And they wanted to have a dinner. And they set the table. There was about 350 people there. About 6 priests and myself. I got there late, which of course is my standard. But it was an amazing experience of the resurrection. And one of the elders, who's a dear, dear friend of mine, and we've come to a great moment of apology and reconciliation beyond people's wildest dreams, spoke, and he said, "I am not a survivor. I am a thriver." And it was a deep experience, of resurrection and new life in what most of the non-Indigenous people coming to that dinner were not expecting. So don't be surprised that the resurrection, the new life, and in Indigenous communities they would refer to it as resiliency, will show up to lead the church to a far better place. And it was just, you need to know that experience happened in this diocese, and it was not initiated by anybody that would be a practicing Catholic. That was really, really powerful. It was beautiful. At that dinner, I sat down with my friend and his wife, and at that point, in August the 15th, which was the Feast of the Assumption of Mary, we had no idea whether Pope Francis was coming to Canada or not. It was still, we had no idea. And I was told very clearly by a few elders, publicly, to tell the rest of the bishops in Canada, do not be afraid. And Bishop, you've got to go to Rome and tell the Pope not to be afraid. I was given my marching orders in no uncertain terms. And I then, took that to heart, and I sat down with my friends, the couple who had been hurt beyond all comprehension in residential school. And I gave my friend my ring, my bishop's ring. And I said, I'm giving you the authority of the bishop in this place. I don't know whether I'm allowed to do that or not, but I did it. I gave him my ring, and I said, this is the only thing I have, looking at that last quote, that is worth anything to me, because it's my mother and father's wedding rings. And I gave him the ring, and I said, this is a pledge that the Holy Father will come to Canada. We had no idea. And I said, if he comes, you can give my ring back if you want to. And until he comes, or whatever Pope comes, I want you to keep this ring. And he kept that ring, and every day, every morning, he took it out and walked on the beach in the little village of Ahousaht, praying the rosary, holding onto the ring. So on August the 15th, I was in that community and in that house, and in a ceremony between him and myself, I got my ring back. But you need to know that the resurrection did not happen because I preached it. It happened from an experience, and it was real. The other thing that happened 2 weeks after that, it was the end of August, the chiefs of Stalo Tribal Council, there's about 12 in Stalo Tribal Council, they phoned me up and they said, Father Gary, we want you to come for dinner. Well, things were pretty tense, as you can recall, after Kamloops, and I had no idea what this was going to be. My opportunity to duck out was, but I'm not the bishop in Vancouver. You probably I think you're looking for the Archbishop of Vancouver. No, we don't know the Archbishop of Vancouver, we know you. So the date was set, and I went for dinner. Again, it was an experience with some significant and very real asks of the church to work and accompany, and all of the things that Bishop Don's going to speak about later. But they were very real, and I was to be the messenger to the Archbishop, because they didn't know the Archbishop. But I wanted to share that with you, that dinner was an experience of resurrection. People who really from the enormity of pain. One not hereditary chief, grand chief was there, spent 10 years at Kamloops, and his wife was 12 years at Kamloops. Every reason that I should, just disappear from the planet. But the experience, and this is why it's important to know, if you want to experience resurrection, you've got to go to the grave. You got to go to the colonizing, painful, hurtful history, and people in our midst who are not survivors but thrivers. And I wanted to let you know that those two events happened within 2 months of Kamloops, and they were for me an amazing experience of where the resurrection happens. And it was concrete, and it was real, and it created a profound journey. So I thought it was important for our diocese and the family that's here to get some sense of some of the amazing opportunities of new life for the church. And it's not my initiative or our initiative. It's an initiative of profound grace found with Indigenous communities right here in our midst. And I've been privileged to be part of those experiences. So you needed to have that to chew on over lunch as we bless the food that we are about to receive from your goodness through Christ our Lord. Amen.
So I do hope you brought your own lunch. If you didn't, you'll have to be really quick because we're going to start here again at 12:30. Thank you. I better run over and get your lunch. It's in my car.
Thank you. I'm going to pick this up before it falls.
Okay.